In a small rented room in Rome, where light barely slips through narrow cracks in cold stone walls, a man sits with his wrist chained to a Roman soldier. There is no polished desk, no library, no freedom. And yet, he writes. Not a philosophical treatise, not an academic volume. He writes letters. Simple, direct words sent to real people. Communities struggling with confusion, conflict, doubt, and slow spiritual drift. This is Paul. And what he writes is not abstract theory. It is life distilled into ink. If you want to keep exploring stories like this, where history, faith, and human struggle intersect, consider subscribing and following the channel. Because what you're about to hear isn't just ancient history, it's a journey that still speaks into the present. 13 letters. In most Bibles, they are arranged by length, not by time. But when you place them back into their original sequence, something changes. They become a map, not of geography, but of a life. A journey that begins with fire and confrontation, moves through building and correction, deepens into reflection, and ends in quiet, unshaken faithfulness. And that journey begins with a fight. After his first missionary journey, Paul returns with troubling news. The communities he helped build, people who had received the message with openness and courage, are now being pulled in another direction. New teachers have arrived, often called Judaizers, insisting that faith in Jesus is not enough. They argue that Gentile believers must also follow the law of Moses, must become culturally and religiously Jewish before they can truly be accepted by God. Pause for a moment and feel the weight of that. Paul had nearly died bringing this message to them. He had been stoned, dragged outside a city, left for dead. And now, others are telling these same people that what he gave them was incomplete. His response is immediate and sharp. Unlike many of his other letters, there is no warm opening, no gentle gratitude, no "I thank God for you." Instead, he begins with confrontation. I am astonished that you are so quickly deserting. This is not just frustration, it is protection. Paul understands that if the foundation shifts, everything built on it collapses. The issue at the center is clear. Is a person made right with God by what they do, or by what God has already done? Paul's answer is unwavering, not by the law, by faith. To make his case, he doesn't start with Moses or commandments. He goes further back, to Abraham, a figure revered as the father of faith. And Abraham, Paul reminds them, was considered righteous, not because he followed a law, because the law hadn't been given yet, but because he believed, he trusted, before evidence, before outcomes, before certainty. What Paul is doing here is subtle but foundational. He is dismantling a deeply embedded system of thought. He is not attacking the law itself, he is redefining its role. The law, he explains, was never meant to save. It functioned more like a guardian, a temporary guide. It reveals the need, but it is not the solution. Like training wheels on a bicycle, necessary for a time, but never the destination. And when Christ comes, that temporary role is fulfilled. This leads Paul to one of the most radical statements of his time, and perhaps even today. In Christ, the dividing lines lose their power. There is no longer Jew or Greek, slave or free, male or female. In a world built on hierarchy, identity, and separation, this is not just a theological idea. It is a quiet revolution. But it's important to understand what Paul means and what he doesn't. He is not saying differences disappear. He is saying those differences no longer define a person's worth before God. Identity is no longer rooted in status, culture, or background, but in relationship with Christ. That is why he fights so fiercely in Galatians, not because he enjoys conflict, but because he knows that if grace is diluted, even slightly, it stops being grace at all. And this is where the story reaches beyond its ancient setting. Because at its core, this is not just about a first-century debate. It touches a question that still lives today. What defines your worth? Is it performance, morality, tradition, achievement? Or is it something deeper, something you cannot earn, only receive? Back in that Roman room, chained and watched, Paul writes with urgency, not just for the Galatians, but for every generation that will wrestle with the same tension, the pull between what must I do to be enough and what has already been done for me. Look closely and you'll see it. That struggle hasn't disappeared, and the story does not slow down, it shifts. From the tension-filled urgency of Galatia, Paul's journey moves across the sea into Macedonia, into a city alive with trade, movement, and restless energy, Thessalonica. It is not a quiet place for reflection. It is a port city, a crossroads of ideas, cultures, and power. And here, in the middle of that noise, something fragile begins. Paul arrives and, for just a few weeks, reasons with people in the synagogue. Some listen, some believe, and as always, others resist. The message spreads quickly, but so does opposition. Accusations rise, crowds are stirred. The claim that there is another king, Jesus, is not taken lightly in a Roman world. And so, under the cover of night, Paul leaves. He doesn't get to stay. He doesn't get to build slowly, carefully. He leaves behind a group of new believers, people who have barely begun to understand what they've stepped into. No established structure, no written New Testament, no safety net, just a message and a memory of the man who brought it. And that's where the anxiety begins. From a distance, Paul starts to wonder, did they hold on? Did fear silence them? Did confusion take over? So he sends Timothy back to check. And when Timothy returns, the report is surprisingly good. Not perfect, but alive. The faith is still there, growing, even under pressure. So Paul writes again. But this time, the tone is different from Galatians. There is no sharp rebuke. There is warmth, relief, affection. You can feel it in the way he speaks, not as a distant teacher, but as someone deeply invested, almost like a parent writing to children he had to leave too soon. And yet, even in that encouragement, there is a question that has begun to trouble them. People have died, not in theory, not as an abstract concept. Real people, friends, family members, have passed away after Paul left. And now the believers are asking something that cuts deeper than doctrine. If Jesus is coming back, what happens to those who died before that moment? Have they missed it? Are they somehow left behind? This is not just curiosity, it's grief mixed with uncertainty. Paul doesn't dismiss the emotion, he steps directly into it. He tells them not to grieve like those who have no hope, not because grief is wrong, but because their understanding changes how they experience it. Then he unfolds something that becomes one of the most defining pictures of Christian hope. When Christ returns, those who have died in him will rise first, not last, not forgotten. First, it reverses their fear completely. The ones they thought were at a disadvantage are, in fact, ahead in the sequence. Death, in this framework, is not a disqualification. It is not an interruption of the promise. And then Paul extends the image further. Those who are still alive will join them, together, reunited, meeting the Lord, not in separation, but in completion. Notice what he does at the end of this explanation. He doesn't say, debate this. He says, encourage one another with these words. This is not meant to create speculation, it's meant to bring comfort. Hope, in Paul's writing, is not an escape from reality. It's something you can carry into the most painful parts of it, into loss, into absence, into the quiet spaces left behind by people who are no longer there. But as time passes, something unexpected happens. The message of Christ's return, this hope-filled truth,
begins to shift in how some people interpret it. What was meant to steady them starts to unbalance them. Word spreads, ideas evolve, and suddenly a new problem appears. Some believers become so focused on the expectation of Jesus returning that they stop engaging with daily life altogether. Work feels unnecessary. Planning feels pointless. Why invest in anything if everything is about to end? They begin to withdraw, not out of laziness in the traditional sense, but out of a distorted form of spiritual urgency. And so Paul writes again. This time, the tone tightens, not harsh, but firm. He doesn't undo the hope. He corrects its application. He reminds them of something simple, almost blunt. If anyone is not willing to work, let him not eat. It sounds practical, almost ordinary, but in this context, it's deeply theological.
Paul is re-establishing a balance that had been lost. Faith in the future does not cancel responsibility in the present. In fact, it should sharpen it. To believe that Christ will return is not an excuse to disengage from life. It is a reason to live it with greater intention, to show up, to contribute, to take responsibility for your actions and your role within the community. Paul himself becomes the example. He reminds them that when he was with them, he worked. He didn't rely on others unnecessarily. He didn't use spiritual authority as a way to avoid effort. He lived in a way that matched his message. And this is where the correction becomes deeper than behavior. It becomes about understanding faith correctly. Because there is a subtle temptation here, one that still exists, to use belief as a way to step away from reality instead of engaging it. Paul pushes against that. He shows that real faith does not remove you from the world. It anchors you within it. It gives you a reason to act, not to withdraw, to build, not to abandon. And so Thessalonians becomes something unique in Paul's letters. It holds two truths in tension: a future that is certain and a present that still matters, a hope that lifts your eyes and a responsibility that keeps your feet grounded. Together, they form a picture that is both stabilizing and challenging, because it removes two extremes at once: despair on one side and passivity on the other. You are not without hope, but you are also not without responsibility. And maybe that's where this part of the story lands most clearly today, because the questions haven't really changed. What happens after death? Does anything we do now still matter? If something greater is coming, how should we live in the meantime? Paul doesn't answer those questions with abstract philosophy. He answers them with direction. Mourn, but with hope. Wait, but while working. Believe, but stay engaged. And in doing so, he brings the story forward again, not just as a record of what was written, but as a pattern for how to live in the space between what has been promised and what has not yet fully arrived. The movement continues, but now the terrain changes again. From Thessalonica, with its fragile hope and careful corrections, the story shifts into a place far more complicated, far more chaotic: Corinth. If Thessalonica was a young, vulnerable community trying to survive, Corinth is something else entirely. It is wealthy, influential, culturally diverse, and deeply unstable. A city where ideas collide, where pleasure is normalized, where boundaries are constantly blurred. To live in Corinth is to live without restraint. And into that environment, Paul had once stepped and built something unlikely: a church. He stayed there longer than usual, about a year and a half. Long enough to lay a foundation, long enough to form relationships, long enough to believe that something solid had begun. But after he leaves, the cracks appear, and they don't stay small. By the time Paul writes what we now call 1 Corinthians, the situation is no longer subtle, it is unraveling. The first issue is division. People within the church are beginning to organize themselves into factions, not openly hostile at first, but gradually separating. One group aligns themselves with Paul, another with Apollos, a gifted speaker, Another claims Peter, and some, perhaps trying to sound more spiritual, claim they belong only to Christ. At first glance, it sounds like preference, but underneath, it is something deeper, identity being tied to human figures instead of the message itself. Paul sees the danger immediately, because once identity shifts from truth to personality, unity begins to fracture. The message becomes secondary. Loyalty replaces understanding. And so he confronts it, not by elevating himself, but by lowering all of them. Is Christ divided? He asks, cutting through the noise. The point is simple. The foundation is not a person. It is Christ. But division is only the surface. As the letter unfolds, the problems deepen. There is moral compromise, serious, visible, undeniable. One case stands out, a man living in a relationship that even the surrounding culture would question. And instead of addressing it, the community has become strangely proud of its tolerance. It's not just that sin exists, that would not be surprising. It's that the response to it has shifted. What should have been confronted is being celebrated. Then come disputes, believers taking each other to court, exposing internal conflict to the outside world. Then, disorder in worship, gatherings that resemble social events more than sacred moments. Wealthier members eating and drinking freely while others are left out. Even the act meant to symbolize unity, the shared meal, becomes a reflection of division. And layered on top of all this is another tension: spiritual gifts. These are meant to build the community, to strengthen, to encourage, to serve. But in Corinth, they have become a source of comparison and competition. Some elevate certain gifts above others. Some use them to display status rather than serve others. It is, in many ways, a complete inversion of purpose. And Paul does not ignore any of it. He moves through each issue, direct, specific, unflinching. But then, in the middle of all this correction, something unexpected happens. He pauses. He steps out of the argument, out of the corrections, and writes something that feels almost still. What we now know as chapter 13. It doesn't come at the beginning. It doesn't come at the end. It appears right in the middle of the discussion about spiritual gifts, almost like a reset point. If I speak in the tongues of men and angels, but do not have love, the words slow everything down. Paul is not dismissing gifts. He is reordering them. He is showing that without love, everything else, no matter how impressive, loses its meaning. Knowledge, generosity, faith, sacrifice, even these can exist without love, and without it, they become empty noise. This is not poetic decoration, it is the center. Love, as Paul describes it, is not abstract. It is practical, measurable, visible in behavior, patience, kindness, humility, endurance. It is not driven by self-interest. It does not seek attention. It does not collapse under pressure. And in a community like Corinth, fractured, competitive, unstable, this is not optional. It is essential. Because without love, unity cannot exist. Correction becomes harsh. Gifts become tools for comparison. Truth becomes weaponized. But even this is not the final foundation. Paul builds towards something deeper still. In chapter 15, he addresses what may be the most critical issue of all, the resurrection. Some in Corinth have begun to question it, not necessarily denying Christ's resurrection outright, but struggling with the idea of a future resurrection for believers. And Paul responds with clarity. If Christ has not been raised, then everything collapses. Faith becomes meaningless. Preaching becomes empty. Sin remains unresolved. Even hope becomes an illusion. This is not a secondary doctrine. It is the core. But Paul doesn't stop at defending it. He reframes it. Christ's resurrection is not an isolated event. It is the beginning of something. A first fruits. A signal that what happened to him will extend to others. It transforms the entire narrative. Death is no longer final. It becomes a passage, not an endpoint. And suddenly, everything, suffering, sacrifice, endurance, gains context. That is 1 Corinthians, a letter that walks into chaos and begins to rebuild, piece by piece, from the inside out. But the story doesn't end there, because between that letter and the next, something happens, something personal. Paul visits Corinth again, and it does not go well. At some point during that visit, he is publicly challenged, possibly humiliated, by someone within the community. And what makes it heavier is not just the attack itself, but the silence that surrounds it, the lack of support, the absence of defense. He leaves, wounded, and instead of returning immediately, he writes another letter, one filled with emotion, with urgency, with tears. A letter we no longer have. By the time he writes what we now call 2 Corinthians, the situation has shifted again. Some have responded, some have changed, but not all. There are still voices opposing him, still people questioning his authority, his presence, even his credibility. They compare him to others, more polished, more impressive, more commanding. Paul's response is unlike anything expected. He does not list his achievements, he lists his suffering. Beatings, shipwrecks, hunger, exhaustion, danger from every direction, outsiders, insiders, nature, circumstance. It reads less like a resume and more like a survival record. Because Paul is redefining strength. In a culture that values appearance, power, eloquence, he points to weakness, endurance, persistence. And then he reveals something even more personal, a thorn in the flesh. He doesn't explain it fully. It remains undefined, some kind of ongoing pain, limitation, or struggle that does not go away. 3 times, he says, he asked for it to be removed. 3 times, the answer was no. But the refusal is not empty. It comes with a statement that reshapes everything. My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. This is the turning point. Strength, in Paul's understanding, is not the absence of weakness. It is what emerges through it. The limitation remains, but it becomes the space where something greater is revealed. And suddenly, the narrative shifts again. Suffering is not just endured, it becomes meaningful. Weakness is not just tolerated, it becomes a vessel. And Paul, instead of resisting it, begins to accept it, even embrace it. Not because he enjoys pain, but because he sees what it allows. And that is where Corinthians leaves us, not with a perfect church, but with a transformed understanding. That unity requires love, that truth requires foundation, that faith requires resurrection, and that strength often looks nothing like what we expect. And then, after the chaos of Corinth, after confrontation, correction, pain, and a deeper understanding of weakness, the story moves into something different again. Not a crisis, not a reaction, but a construction. Because now, Paul writes to a place he has never been. Rome, the center of power, the heart of the empire, a city filled with influence, diversity, tension, and a growing community of believers that Paul did not start. He does not know most of them personally. He has not shaped their foundation, and that changes how he writes. In Galatia, he fought. In Thessalonica, he comforted and corrected. In Corinth, he repaired what was breaking. But in Romans, he builds, carefully, systematically, almost like an architect, laying out a structure that must stand on its own. There is no immediate crisis driving the letter. Instead, there is intention. Paul wants to make the message clear, fully clear, not assumed, not partial. He writes as if he is placing each stone deliberately, knowing that this might be the first and only explanation some of them receive. And he begins not with encouragement, but with reality. All have sinned. Not some, not most. All. It's not a comfortable starting point, but it is a necessary one. Because Paul is removing every possible exception. It doesn't matter whether someone is religious or not, whether they have the law or not, whether they see themselves as moral or broken. The conclusion is the same. No one reaches the standard of God on their own. This is the foundation, not to condemn, but to clarify the problem. Because without understanding the depth of the issue, the solution will never be fully understood. And once that ground is set, Paul moves forward. The solution is not effort, not improvement, not trying harder. It is justification by faith. A phrase that sounds technical, but carries something profoundly simple. Being declared right with God, not because of what you achieve, but because of what has already been done through Christ. It is not earned, it is received. And this changes everything. Because if righteousness is given, not achieved, then the relationship between humanity and God shifts completely. It is no longer based on performance, it is based on grace. And from that point, Paul begins to unfold the consequences. Peace with God, not partial peace, not temporary relief, a restored relationship. The tension that once defined the connection, guilt, distance, separation, is resolved, not gradually, but decisively. And alongside that comes something else, freedom. Freedom from sin, not in the sense that struggle disappears, but in the sense that sin no longer holds authority. It is no longer the defining force, it no longer has the final word. But Paul doesn't simplify the experience, because even as he explains this freedom, he acknowledges something deeply human, something many recognize immediately, the internal conflict. I want to do what is right, but I don't do it. It's one of the most honest moments in all his writing, because it refuses to pretend that transformation is instant or effortless. It reveals the tension between intention and action, between understanding and execution. And in doing so, it removes a quiet assumption that knowing the truth automatically leads to living it. It doesn't. There is still a struggle. But Paul doesn't leave it unresolved. He moves into what many consider the peak of the entire letter, perhaps even one of the most powerful sections in all of Scripture. There is now no condemnation for those who are in Christ Jesus. Not less condemnation, not delayed judgment, none. It is a complete shift in status. The identity of the believer is no longer defined by failure, by past actions, by inconsistency. It is redefined entirely by relationship with Christ. And from that point, Paul expands the idea outward, widening it beyond internal experience into something almost cosmic. If God is for you, who can be against you? He begins listing everything that could possibly create distance, hardship, suffering, danger, even death itself. Visible forces, invisible forces, present realities, future uncertainties. And then he closes the door on all of them. Nothing can separate, not height, not depth, not time, not power, not circumstance. The love of God, once established through Christ, is not fragile, it is not conditional, it is not easily disrupted, it holds. And in that declaration, something stabilizes. Because the foundation is no longer dependent on human consistency, it is anchored in something far more constant. But Paul doesn't stop with theology, he never does. Because truth, for him, is not complete until it becomes visible in life. So beginning in chapter 12, the tone shifts again. The structure remains, but the focus changes, from what is true to how that truth is lived. If this is all real, then what does your life look like? He answers it directly. Offer your life, not as something to earn favor, but as a response to what has already been given. A living sacrifice, not a moment, but a continuous posture. Transformation begins in the mind, how you think, how you interpret, how you respond, not conforming to the patterns around you, but being reshaped from within. And then it moves outward. Relationships. Humility replaces pride. Service replaces self-focus. Love becomes active, not theoretical, but expressed in patience, generosity, and sincerity. Even in conflict, the instruction is clear. Do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. It is not passive, it is intentional. And suddenly, the letter that began with universal failure ends with practical direction, not because behavior earns anything, but because it reflects something. A transformed life is not the requirement for grace, it is the result of it. And this is why Romans stands apart. It does not just present ideas, it connects them. From sin to grace, from grace to identity, from identity to transformation. Each step builds on the last, forming something complete. And when you step back and look at it as a whole, you begin to see why this letter has carried so much weight across history. Because it doesn't just answer questions, it reframes them. It doesn't just tell you what to believe, it shows you how belief reshapes everything else. And within the larger journey of Paul's life, it marks a moment of clarity, not the end, not the conclusion, but a point where everything he has fought for, explained, corrected, and lived, comes together in one place. A message strong enough to stand on its own, even in a city he had never yet seen. And then, after the clarity of Romans, after the structure, the logic, the careful unfolding of truth, the story narrows again. Not outward toward cities Paul has not yet seen, but inward, into confinement, into stillness. Paul is arrested. The movement that once carried him across regions, through crowded streets and hostile synagogues, now stops. The roads are gone. The constant motion is replaced by walls, by guards, by long stretches of waiting. And yet, something unexpected happens here. The message does not shrink, it deepens. Because in these prison letters, Paul is no longer reacting to immediate crises or laying broad foundations. He is reflecting, drawing connections that stretch beyond individual communities into something larger, more integrated, more enduring. He begins with what we now call Ephesians. If Romans is structured like an argument, Ephesians feels more like a panoramic view. It steps back and looks at everything at once, not just what God has done, but how it fits together across time. Paul speaks of a plan, something not improvised, not reactive, but intentional from the beginning. A design that existed before people were aware of it, before the divisions, before the confusion, before the need for correction. And at the center of that plan is grace, not as a concept, but as a decisive action. Salvation, Paul insists again, is not earned, it is given. Not the result of human effort, but the expression of divine initiative. But Ephesians does something more. It expands the scope, because salvation is not only about individuals, it forms something collective, the church. And Paul describes it not as an institution, not as a structure, but as a body, a living organism. Christ as the head, believers as interconnected parts. Different roles, different functions, but one unified identity. It changes how everything is understood. Because if the church is a body, then division is not just disagreement, it is dysfunction. Growth is not individual success, it is collective maturity. And every part matters, not equally in function, but equally in value. Then, toward the end, Paul introduces an image that has endured across generations, the armor of God, not as metaphor alone, but as a framework for understanding reality. Because the struggle, he explains, is not merely physical. It is not just about circumstances or visible conflict. There is something deeper, an unseen dimension where truth, deception, resistance, and endurance all intersect. So he describes preparation, truth as a belt, holding everything together, righteousness as a breastplate, protecting what is vital, faith as a shield, intercepting what would otherwise wound, and the word of God as a sword, not defensive, but active. It is not a call to fear, it is a call to awareness, to live as if what cannot be seen still matters. And then, from that wide, almost cosmic perspective, the tone shifts again as Paul writes to another community, Philippi. If Ephesians is expansive, Philippians is intimate. There is a warmth here that feels different, personal, relational. This is a church that has supported him, cared for him, remained connected even when distance made it difficult. And yet, the context is still the same. He is still in prison, which makes what he writes almost paradoxical. Joy, not once, but repeatedly. It appears again and again, not as a fleeting emotion,
but as a consistent thread. And that raises a quiet question. How does someone speak of joy from confinement? Paul answers not by explaining circumstances, but by reframing them. Joy, in his understanding, is not dependent on comfort. It is anchored in something deeper: purpose, connection, and perspective. And then, in the middle of the letter, he includes what many consider one of the most profound passages he ever wrote. A hymn, a reflection on Christ, not just what he did, but how he did it. Though in the form of God, he did not cling to status. He did not hold on to position. Instead, he emptied himself, took the form of a servant, entered into limitation, into humanity, into obedience, even to death. It reverses expectation, because in most systems, power moves upward. It accumulates, protects, asserts itself. But here, power moves downward. It relinquishes, it serves, it sacrifices. And Paul presents this not just as theology, but as a pattern. Have this mindset among yourselves. In other words, this is not only about Christ, it is about imitation. Joy, humility, service, these are not separate ideas, they are connected. And then the focus shifts again to Colossae. Here, the issue is not internal division or external pressure, it is distortion. Ideas are beginning to circulate that reshape how Christ is understood. Philosophies blending with spiritual language. Practices that appear meaningful but shift the center away from him. And Paul responds by doing something very precise. He elevates Christ. Not slightly, not incrementally, completely. He describes him as the image of the invisible God, the firstborn over all creation, not in the sense of being created, but in authority. In him, all things were made. Through him, all things hold together. The language expands again, almost echoing Ephesians, but now with a sharper edge. Because this is not just about understanding, it is about correction. If Christ is supreme, fully sufficient, fully complete, then nothing needs to be added. Not rituals, not philosophical systems, not human traditions that claim to deepen spirituality while quietly shifting its foundation. Paul is not rejecting discipline or thought. He is rejecting anything that competes with the centrality of Christ. Because once the center shifts, everything else eventually follows. And finally, the most personal of all, Philemon. No large theological argument, no structured explanation, just a letter, short, direct, relational. It concerns a man named Onesimus, a slave. At some point, Onesimus has left his master, Philemon, possibly fleeing, possibly taking something with him. But somehow, in that unexpected journey, he meets Paul, and something changes. He becomes a believer. Now the situation becomes complicated, because legally, socially, culturally, Onesimus is still a slave. Returning him would mean restoring that structure. Keeping him would mean disrupting it. Paul chooses a different path. He sends him back, but not as he was. He writes to Philemon, not commanding, but appealing, not enforcing, but persuading. Receive him, not as a slave, but as a brother. It is a quiet sentence, but it carries enormous weight, because it does not attack the system directly. It transforms the relationship within it. And once a relationship changes, the system begins to lose its grip. This is the gospel, applied at the smallest scale, not in theory, not in abstraction, but in how one person sees another. And that is where the prison letters leave us. Not with expansion, but with depth. A plan that stretches across eternity, a joy that exists within limitation, a Christ who stands above all distortion, and a relationship that redefines identity itself. The movement has slowed, but the message has never been clearer. And as the movement reaches its later stage, the tone changes once more.
The wide vision of Ephesians, the quiet joy of Philippians, the theological clarity of Colossians, and the personal appeal of Philemon now give way to something more focused, more intentional. The question is no longer just what is true, it becomes who will carry it forward. Because Paul is aging. The years of travel, conflict, imprisonment, they have taken their toll. The mission is no longer only about expansion, it is about continuity. And so he writes not just to churches, but to individuals, leaders, Timothy, Titus, men who are no longer just learners, but carriers of responsibility. In what we call 1 Timothy, the tone is structured, almost instructional. The focus is clear. The church must not only exist, it must be ordered, because without structure, even truth can become unstable. Paul addresses practical realities. False teachings are emerging, not always openly aggressive, but subtle, persuasive, capable of distorting the message from within. And Timothy is left to navigate this, not from a distance, but from inside the complexity. So Paul gives direction. Guard the teaching, not aggressively, not defensively, but carefully, because what is taught shapes what is believed, and what is believed shapes how people live. Then he moves to leadership. Not charisma, not influence, not outward success, character. Those who lead must be above reproach, not perfect, but consistent, self-controlled, faithful, able to manage their own lives before attempting to guide others. Because leadership, in Paul's understanding, is not about position, it is about trust. And trust is built over time through visible integrity. Then he speaks of the church itself, not as a loose gathering, but as a living structure that requires care. Relationships, roles, responsibilities, all must function together. Faith is not isolated, it exists in community, and that community must be guided, not left to drift. From Timothy, the focus shifts to Titus, but the challenge intensifies. Because Titus is not in a stable environment, he is in Crete, a place known, even in its own time, for instability, unpredictability, and moral inconsistency. The cultural backdrop is not supportive of discipline or order, it resists it. And yet, Paul does not lower the standard, he raises it. Appoint leaders, he says, establish structure, teach what is sound. Not because the environment makes it easy, but because the environment makes it necessary. Truth, in a difficult context, does not become less important, it becomes more visible. And again, the emphasis returns to character. Leaders must not only teach well, they must live in a way that reinforces what they teach. Because in a place where words are easily dismissed, actions carry weight. And then Paul expands the instruction outward. Older men, younger men, women, families. Each group has a role. Each relationship becomes part of the larger witness. Because transformation is not abstract, it appears in how people live, speak, respond, and relate to one another. Even in a difficult environment, a well-ordered life becomes evidence. And then, finally, the last letter, 2 Timothy. The tone shifts again, but this time it is unmistakable. This is not instruction for building, it is preparation for ending. Paul is no longer anticipating release. He knows where this is going. The language becomes more personal, more reflective. There is urgency, but also clarity. He speaks of abandonment, of people who have left, of others who have turned away. The circle around him has grown smaller, and yet the message does not weaken. If anything, it sharpens. He urges Timothy to remain steady, to continue, to endure, not because it will be easy, but because it will not. Preach the word, in season and out of season. In other words, whether it is received or rejected, whether it is convenient or costly, stay faithful. Because the standard has never been immediate success. It has always been endurance. And then comes the moment that feels like a quiet conclusion, not dramatic, not exaggerated, but final. I have fought the good fight.
I have finished the race. I have kept the faith. There is no claim of perfection, no list of achievements, only 3 things. He fought, he finished, he remained. It is a different definition of victory, not measured by numbers, influence, or visible impact, but by persistence, by consistency over time, by refusing to abandon what was entrusted to him. And then, almost unexpectedly, the letter narrows again, back into something deeply human. He asks Timothy to come. He asks for his cloak. He asks for his books. Simple things, practical things. And in those requests, something becomes visible that no theological argument can fully capture. The man who wrote about grace, about power, about eternal plans, he is still human, still cold, still needing companionship, still wanting to read. And that is where the story settles. Not in a grand finale, not in a public moment of recognition, but in a quiet prison cell, an aging man, limited in movement, waiting, and yet not shaken. Because when you step back and look at everything, the journeys, the letters, the conflicts, the corrections, the reflections, you begin to see patterns emerge. The gospel, first of all, is never abstract. It adapts. Not in its truth, but in its application. It meets people where they are. Galatia, Thessalonica, Corinth, Rome, Ephesus, Crete. Different problems, different contexts. The same message, expressed with precision for each situation. It is personal. Then, suffering. It appears again and again, not as interruption, but as part of the process. Not something that disqualifies, but something that reveals. Power, in Paul's life, is not displayed through ease, but through endurance, through the ability to continue when continuing is difficult. And finally, success. It is redefined completely. Not growth, not recognition, not influence, faithfulness. To remain when it would be easier to leave. To speak when it would be safer to stay silent. To hold on, not perfectly, but persistently. And so the final image is not one of triumph in the way the world understands it. It is quieter. A man in a prison, asking for a cloak against the cold, asking for books to keep learning, waiting, not for escape, but for completion. Weak in body, but unshaken in faith. And in that stillness, the entire journey finds its meaning.